There is a kind of silence that only exists in an empty gym at 5 in the morning, before the sun comes up, before the world wakes up and starts telling you who you're supposed to be. That silence is where our story begins. A locked door. A single light bulb swinging from a wire. And a 15-year-old boy standing in front of a mirror, throwing a punch he doesn't believe in yet. By the end of this story, that punch will save a life. Not by hurting anyone. By healing someone. And if you stay with me for the next few minutes, I promise you'll understand why Kung Fu was never really about fighting at all. Before we get into it, if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button and tap the like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. This is Black Belt Legacy, and we tell the stories that never made it into the history books, but deserve to. Now let's go back to a cold October in a town called Millbrook, Ohio. Millbrook was the kind of town that used to make things. Steel, mostly, and before that, glass. But by the time our story starts, the factories were mostly shut down, their windows broken out like missing teeth, and the town had the tired, hollow feeling of a place that used to matter and wasn't sure it did anymore. It was the kind of town where fathers disappeared into bottles and mothers worked 2 jobs and kids raised themselves in the spaces between. Marcus Riley was one of those kids. 15 years old, quick-tempered, and angrier than he had any right to be, though anyone who knew his story would tell you he had every right in the world. His father left when he was 7. His mother worked doubles at the diner off Route 9, coming home smelling like fryer oil and exhaustion, too tired most nights to do anything but fall asleep on the couch with her shoes still on. Marcus had been in 3 fights that year already, all of them started by someone else, all of them ended by him, and none of them making him feel any better afterward. The 3rd fight was the one that got him expelled from Millbrook High for 2 weeks. It was over something small, the way these things always are. A kid named Tyler Brennan had said something about his mother, about the diner, about the kind of woman who serves coffee to strangers for a living. Marcus didn't remember deciding to hit him. He just remembered the sound his knuckles made against Tyler's jaw, and the silence that followed, and the way the whole cafeteria had gone still, like the air itself was holding its breath. His mother, Diane, sat across from the vice principal's desk with her hands folded so tight her knuckles went white, and she didn't say much on the drive home. She didn't need to. The disappointment on her face said everything. That night, Marcus sat on the back steps of their small rented house, staring at nothing, feeling the particular kind of loneliness that comes from knowing you've let down the one person who never gave up on you. That's when he first saw the light in the old Ye building. The Ye building had been empty for as long as Marcus could remember. It used to be a hardware store, back when Millbrook still needed hardware stores, and then it had been nothing at all, just a boarded-up storefront with a faded sign and a for-lease notice that had been peeling off the glass for at least a decade. But that night, there was a light on inside. A single bulb, swinging gently, casting long shadows across dusty floorboards. Marcus wandered closer, more out of boredom than curiosity, and looked through the grimy window. Inside, an old man was sweeping the floor. He looked to be in his 70s, maybe older, with close-cropped white hair and forearms that seemed too strong for a man his age. He moved with a kind of quiet efficiency, like every motion had a purpose, like nothing about him was wasted. Marcus stood there longer than he meant to, and eventually the old man looked up and met his eyes through the glass, and neither of them looked away. The old man's name was Chun Wei Long, though almost nobody in Millbrook ever learned to pronounce it right, and most just called him Mr. Chen. He had come to America 30 years earlier, in a story he rarely told anyone, from a small village in southern China where he had trained since he was 6 years old under a master who had, in turn, trained since he himself was a boy. Wei Long had crossed an ocean carrying almost nothing but the clothes on his back and the forms his body had memorized before he could read. He had worked in kitchens, in laundries, in factories, always saving, always waiting, until finally, at an age when most men are thinking about retirement, he had saved enough to rent the old hardware store and turn it into something else. A kung fu school. Though in Millbrook, almost nobody came. The next day, Marcus walked past the Yi building again, telling himself he was just taking the long way home. The door was propped open this time, and he could hear something from inside, a rhythmic sound, like breath and movement working together. He stood in the doorway and watched Mr. Chen move through a form alone in the empty space, his motion slow and deliberate one moment, explosive the next, like water that could turn to stone and back again without warning. "You want to come in, or you want to let all the cold air in with you?" Mr. Chen said, without turning around. Marcus almost left. Almost. But something kept his feet planted in that doorway, some part of him that was tired of being angry and didn't know what else to do with all that feeling. He stepped inside. For the first few weeks, Mr. Chen didn't teach him a single strike. Not one punch, not one kick. Marcus would show up after school, his knuckles still sore from the fight that had gotten him suspended, ready to learn how to hit harder, how to make sure nobody ever said anything about his mother again. Instead, Mr. Chen had him sweep the floor. He had him carry water. He had him stand in a horse stance against the wall for what felt like hours, his thighs burning, sweat running down his back, while Mr. Chen sat nearby drinking tea and reading a newspaper like nothing unusual was happening at all. "This is stupid," Marcus said one afternoon, his legs shaking. "I came here to learn how to fight." Mr. Chen didn't even look up from his paper. "You already know how to fight," he said. "You proved that in your cafeteria. What you don't know is how to stop." Marcus didn't understand what that meant. Not yet. But something about the old man's calm, about the way he never raised his voice, about the stillness that seemed to live inside him even when his hands were moving faster than Marcus could track, made him come back the next day. And the day after that. And the day after that. Weeks became months. Diane noticed the change before Marcus did. He started coming home with a different kind of tired, not the restless, coiled tension he used to carry, but something looser, something that let him actually sleep at night instead of lying awake replaying every insult he'd ever swallowed. She asked him about it one evening while she was folding laundry, and he told her, a little embarrassed, about the old man and the empty hardware store and the horse stance that still made his legs shake even after 2 months. "Can I meet him?" she asked. She did, the following Saturday, standing in the doorway of the Yi building in her work uniform, still smelling faintly of the diner. Mr. Chen made her tea, the good kind, the kind he kept for guests he respected, and the two of them talked for almost an hour while Marcus swept the floor, pretending not to listen. What she learned that day was that Mr. Chen didn't charge tuition to families who couldn't afford it, which was most of the families in that end of Millbrook. What he asked for instead was commitment. Show up. Do the work. Don't quit when it gets hard, and it will get hard. Diane looked at her son, who had been suspended twice in 1 year and hadn't smiled in longer than she could remember, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen in a long time. She shook Mr. Chen's hand and told him her son would be there every single day. The training that followed wasn't glamorous. There were no cinematic montages, no dramatic music, just the slow, grinding work of building something real inside a person, one repetition at a time. Marcus learned to breathe before he learned to strike. He learned to fall before he learned to throw. He learned that real kung fu, the kind Mr. Chen had carried across an ocean, wasn't about being the toughest person in the room. It was about becoming someone who didn't need to prove that to anyone, including himself. There is a particular moment that Mr. Chen talked about more than any other, one that Marcus would carry with him for the rest of his life. It happened about 8 months into his training, on a night when Marcus, frustrated after failing to land a technique for the 20th time, threw his hands up and snapped at the old man, telling him this was pointless, that he was never going to get it, that maybe he should just quit. Mr. Chen set down the wooden practice sword he'd been holding and looked at Marcus for a long moment. "You know why bamboo survives the storm when the mighty oak falls?" he asked. Marcus, sweaty and frustrated, shook his head. "The oak stands rigid. It fights the wind with all its strength, until the wind wins anyway, and the oak splits in half. The bamboo bends. It moves with the storm instead of against it. It survives not because it is stronger, but because it knows when to yield and when to stand firm. This is the heart of everything I am teaching you. Not how to become unbreakable. How to become unbendable in the ways that matter, and flexible in every other way, so that life cannot snap you in half." Marcus didn't fully understand it that night. But he never forgot it, and slowly, over the months that followed, he began to feel it in his bones rather than just his mind, the way real wisdom works its way in. By the time Marcus turned 16, something had shifted in him that everyone around him could see, even people who didn't know why. Teachers noticed he no longer flinched into anger at every provocation. His mother noticed he had started doing his homework at the kitchen table instead of avoiding it. And Tyler Brennan, the boy whose jaw had once met Marcus's fist, noticed something too, though it would take a crisis for him to understand what it meant. That crisis came on a Friday night in November, at a party in a half-finished basement on the edge of town, the kind of gathering that happens when parents are away and teenagers fill the silence with bad decisions. Marcus wasn't planning to go, but a friend had talked him into it, promising it would just be a couple hours, nothing crazy. It didn't stay that way. Tyler Brennan showed up drunk, with two older guys nobody recognized, guys who'd clearly had more than beer and were looking for trouble the way certain people always seem to be. An argument broke out over something forgettable, a spilled drink, a comment taken the wrong way, and within minutes it had escalated the way these things do, voices rising, chests puffing, someone shoving someone else. One of the older guys, a big kid with a shaved head and knuckles already scraped from some earlier fight, grabbed Tyler by the collar and slammed him against the wall hard enough to crack the drywall. A year earlier, Marcus would have been the one throwing that punch. He knew the old version of himself well enough to recognize how easily this could have been him, on either side of that wall. But instead, he found himself moving through the crowd, not with anger, but with the same calm, grounded presence Mr. Chen had spent a year building into him. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply stepped between the big kid and Tyler, his stance low and rooted, his voice level. "That's enough," Marcus said. "He's had too much to drink. He's not worth your time." The big kid turned his fury on Marcus instead, throwing a wild, drunken punch that Marcus slipped with barely any movement at all, the same slip he'd drilled 1,000 times against the wall of the Yi building while Mr. Chen counted in a language Marcus was only beginning to learn. He didn't strike back. He redirected the bigger boy's momentum, let his own overextended punch carry him past Marcus and into the wall, and then simply stood there, steady, unbothered, refusing to escalate no matter how much the bigger boy screamed at him to fight. It was that refusal, more than any punch could have, that ended the confrontation. The bigger boy, drunk and off balance and suddenly aware that a crowd of sober teenagers was watching him fail to provoke a fight from someone half his size, stormed out with his friend, muttering threats that everyone understood were empty. Tyler Brennan sat on the basement floor, shaking, and looked up at Marcus with an expression that had nothing to do with the boy who'd mocked his mother a year before. "Why'd you help me?" Tyler asked. "After what I said to you." Marcus thought about it for a moment, and then he said something that surprised even himself, something that sounded exactly like the old man who'd been feeding him tea and wisdom for a year. "Because you needed help. That's it. That's the whole reason." Word of what happened at that party spread through Millbrook High faster than any rumor Marcus had ever been part of before, but this time it wasn't a rumor about a fight. It was something else, something people didn't quite have language for at first, a story about a kid who could have hurt someone and chose not to, who had all the tools to win a fight and instead used them to end one. Tyler Brennan started showing up at the Yi building the following week, standing awkwardly in the doorway the same way Marcus once had, and Mr. Chen, without a word of judgment about what had happened between the two boys a year earlier, simply handed him a broom and told him to start sweeping. Over the next 2 years, that empty hardware store on the edge of a dying steel town slowly filled with kids nobody else seemed to want. Kids who'd been kicked out of other programs. Kids whose parents worked too many hours to notice where they went after school. Kids who were angry, or scared, or lost, or all three at once. Mr. Chen never turned anyone away who was willing to sweep the floor and show up the next day. And Marcus, who had once stood in that same doorway not sure if he belonged anywhere, became something he never expected, an assistant instructor, patiently walking new students through the same horse stance that had once made his own legs shake with frustration. There's a particular kind of full circle that only happens when you've truly changed, and Marcus felt it the day he found himself telling a furious 14-year-old, a kid who'd just been suspended for fighting, the exact same words Mr. Chen had once told him. You already know how to fight. What you don't know is how to stop. He watched the words land on that kid's face the way they'd once landed on his own, disbelief turning slowly into curiosity, and he understood in that moment what Mr. Chen had actually been building in Millbrook. Not fighters. Something much harder to create, and much more valuable. People who had learned to carry their own storms without breaking, and without breaking anyone else either. Mr. Chen passed away 4 years later, quietly, in his sleep, in the small apartment above the Yi building where he'd lived for 3 decades. He was buried on a cold morning with more people at his funeral than anyone in Millbrook could have predicted, dozens of former students, now grown, now scattered across the country, who had driven hours or flown in from wherever life had taken them to say goodbye to the old man who had changed the direction of their lives without ever raising his voice to do it. Marcus, 20 years old by then and studying to become a teacher himself, stood up at that funeral and told the story of the horse stance and the bamboo and the storm, and he watched grown men and women wipe their eyes, because every single one of them remembered the exact lesson that had cracked something open inside them too. He talked about how Kung Fu had never been about violence at all, not really, not the way Mr. Chen taught it. It had been about discipline. About patience. About learning to hold your ground without needing to prove anything to anyone. About turning pain into purpose instead of letting it curdle into something that hurts everyone around you, including yourself. After the funeral, the question of what would happen to the Yi building hung over the community like a held breath. The building was old, the roof needed work, and nobody had the money or the ownership to keep it running. But Marcus, along with a handful of other former students, pooled together what savings they had, took out a small loan, and made a decision that would have made the old man proud in the quietest way possible. They kept the doors open. They kept the tuition free for anyone who couldn't pay. They kept the broom by the door for every new kid who walked in angry and unsure whether they belonged there. Today, if you drive through Millbrook, Ohio, past the shuttered storefronts and the quiet streets that still remember better days, you'll find the Yi building still standing, its window no longer grimy, its sign no longer peeling. Inside, most afternoons, you'll find a room full of kids in white uniforms, moving through forms with the same slow, deliberate focus Mr. Chen once brought to that empty space 30 years earlier. Some of them are angry when they arrive. Most of them are, if we're honest. But they don't stay that way, not because someone taught them how to hit harder, but because someone taught them how to stand still inside the storm. Marcus still teaches there most evenings, after his day job, standing in front of the same mirror where he once threw a punch he didn't believe in. He tells every new student the same thing Mr. Chen told him on his very first day, the thing that took him years to fully understand but has never once stopped being true. You already know how to fight, he tells